Hi everyone, and welcome to this Deakin Library talk with Emilia Bell about critical librarianship. Thank you all for coming. A special thank you to Hero McDonald, the University Librarian, under whose leadership I am privileged to work, and the Library Exhibitions and Public Programs team and the comms team for organising and advertising the event today. I acknowledge that I am today located on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung, in Jar or country on Burwood campus. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the unceded lands, skies and waterways on which Deakin students, staff and communities come together. We pay our deep respects to the ancestors and elders of Wadawurrung country, East Tamar country and Wurundjeri country where our campuses are located. I also note that Emelia is coming to us from Wajak Noongar Budja in the southwest of WA, I think from Murdoch University, noting that Murdoch University is located right near the Belia wetlands. It's a chain of wetlands that have very high social and cultural importance to Noongar peoples. Murdoch is also located not far from Walyalla, which is Fremantle, and probably at the same distance to Boorloo, Perth, and that's by car. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. So we've 1 hour session today. Time permitting, we'll have time for Q&A. My colleagues Jackson, Lucinda and Dom will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. We do ask you to please put your questions in the Q&A section and not in the chat. It just makes it a little bit easier for us to monitor and also see if there's any recurring themes. We'll also take questions at the end by the raise of hand feature, and also a few of us will have our cameras on just so that Emelia doesn't feel like they're speaking into the void. For those who don't know me, I'm Tui Raven. I'm the Senior Manager of Indigenous Programs at Deakin Library. So I commenced in July 2023, so just a little over a year ago. And I started here obviously as a Senior Manager. I was lucky to come into the space at Deakin Library that was, in my opinion, very well set up. Gave us some leadership direction in relation to human-centered knowledge and interrogating our physical and digital spaces. I started this role with a firm foundation and the idea that Indigenous programs would assist Deakin staff and our broader community with understanding why Indigenous knowledge is important and should be included in your everyday way of life. This is also something that is a huge strategic thing for Deakin University, believe in embedding Indigenous knowledges within course curriculum. It's also important to understand that library and information science in the context of critical librarianship, that's the first step that we have to take. So the Deakin Library Plan also sets out the scene for critical librarianship and interrogating and addressing issues of power, privilege and historical marginalisation of Indigenous and LGBTQI+ voices. So this talk by Emilia Bell today will guide us through critical librarianship and agency and action in the library, which is, as I said, is also very important for the process of indigenising library spaces. Emilia Bell is the Manager of Research and Digital Services at Murdoch University and previously held a role at USQ as a project coordinator. Emilia runs the GLAMR Disability in Dialogue podcast and is the co-founder and chair of the Association of Neurodivergent and Disabled GLAMR Professionals Australia. Emelia is newly appointed. My apologies, Emelia, for spelling your name incorrectly if I've got it up there incorrect. Is newly appointed ALIA Board member and is a recipient of the 2024 ALIA Metcalf Award, which recognises high achievement by all ALIA high achievement by an ALIA personal member in the first 5 years of practice in the libraries and information services. Please welcome Emelia, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Tui, and I will shift to sharing my screen. So firstly, thank you so much, Tui, for inviting me to speak today. And I do wish that I could have travelled to Deakin in person like we'd originally planned. But as Tui's mentioned, I've been busy moving to Western Australia. And so instead, I'm really honoured to be speaking from the unceded lands of the Wajak and Noongar people. Wajak Noongar country is absolutely beautiful. And being new to this place, I'm at the very beginning of learning about the history and connections to this land. And I do want to pay my respect to elders past and present, and I also extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. And that part where I'm still learning in a new place is something that I do see as really valuable and important to critical librarianship. So at the moment, I have this opportunity to learn, to care, listen, and also to be connecting. And I can continue to improve my understanding and my actions. And in the same vein, I see critical librarianship as being this opportunity for continuous improvement in our work, profession, and also in our institutions. In some ways, critical librarianship does feel like a slightly challenging topic to speak on, and it's certainly not because we don't already have a lot of literature or theory on this. There's plenty of incredible people before me who have already written and spoken about critical librarianship, and I hope that people will continue to do so. It's challenging though, because there has already been a lot written and spoken about it. I suspect that many of the values and some of the perspectives that come across when I speak today aren't going to be significantly different from people who have already addressed this. Ultimately, critical librarianship is about recognizing and addressing those structural biases and inequities and bringing a social justice perspective to library work. And throughout everything that I say, that's not going to change today. But having been invited to speak, I do hope that I might be able to highlight some different ways of framing critical librarianship that are broadly relevant, so regardless of what kind of role or sector that you're in, and also more importantly, some different questions that you can also ask in your own practice. Before we go any further though, I am actually curious to hear from everyone who's joined us today, and we do have a lot of people. So what does critical librarianship mean to you? If you would like to just head over to Slido really quickly, you can share some of your thoughts. So this could be how you personally define critical librarianship, your perspective on it, maybe a few words that come to mind when you hear that phrase. I'll just wait for everyone to add a few things. So inclusivity, equity, we've got a few people who aren't quite sure. Caring, questioning. So we've got inclusive and equitable coming through, social justice, like we mentioned, growth, correcting for bias. We've got non-hierarchical as well, which I think really plays into that power aspect, speaking up. So again, that criticality and that aspect of challenging. I like that we've got thoughtful and reflective as well. So those are things that I'm going to address a little bit later too. Information with context and meaning. So I do like that context kind of part and situating libraries within that broader context. And as I'm about to address that bigger picture. And again, a lot about power, privilege, equity, some of those themes that we see across diversity and inclusion work as well. Theory. Got quite a few there, reflection and empathy, challenging established practices. So I think that's also, again, where that criticality and questions kind of come in, and also understanding our approach to do that. And I like that we've got a few personal aspects there as well. So that constantly evolving growth, curiosity, and kind of that looking back at our own kind of approaches to things and understanding how we address our practices, and making sure that we're not just looking just at our own work, but that broader social context that it exists in as well. So thank you everyone for contributing. I think we've got a very broad set of perspectives there, but ones that all kind of focus on that common theme, and some different ways, I think, of how we might approach it and understand it ourselves as well. Lots of different perspectives. So today, I do want to start by situating libraries in the bigger picture. Before I started in librarianship, I studied international relations. So that was part of my undergraduate degree. And part of the reason I chose to study international relations was because I suspect for many people, I'd grown up aware of the inequality that exists globally. And so that's something that I think drives a lot of people to want to study international relations. There's an idea of being able to address inequality, injustice, disparity, all of the themes that we've just seen come up in that Slido as well. But there was also a second reason for me, and that was understanding. So I really wanted to understand how everything connected and fit together. I wanted to be able to make sense of the system with its different processes and power structures that I was a part of, but only in a really small way. And I suspect that is sometimes how we feel in libraries. We know that we're part of the bigger picture, but that's often within the confines of a larger parent or host institution. We know the value that library services can provide. We talk about the good that they can do within the messiness of those social and institutional structures, but we also recognise that we're only one part of them. And sometimes that can feel like a small part. When I did move to a career in librarianship though, I never quite lost my interest in international relations. And so I combined that wanting to understand that bigger picture the actors, processes, systems, and structures that make up that bigger picture with an interest in knowledge. And I do see knowledge as being a really big part of addressing the injustices and inequalities that exist around us, and also within libraries themselves as well. So with this bigger picture view in mind today, I'm going to be speaking about critical librarianship, or CritLib, but not actually spending a lot of time presenting an exact definition. And I'm also going to hold off briefly on giving any kind of definition, and there's a couple of reasons for this. First, definitions are pretty easy to find in critical librarianship. I imagine everyone here either works in a library, higher education, GLAMR sector, or some kind of related field or discipline. And so I do trust that we all know how to find a definition. Second, I really want to focus on the action that's attached to critical librarianship. So we can understand the theory behind critical librarianship absolutely perfectly, and that is going to be part of what I speak on today, and it is important to understand. But theory alone isn't what drives any kind of change or impact. So instead of providing you with a perfect definition to unpack, I'm going to be leaving you with some questions today. And many of them are fairly broad questions, but they're also critical questions. So they're intended to help you to critique and to challenge, to reveal some of the values, the knowledge systems, and also the social structures that underlie your practices. And I do suspect that there's also many people here who already work towards applying a critical librarianship lens to their own practice, perhaps inadvertently, and they don't quite realize that's already what they're doing. So for those people, my hope is that these questions might provide some new angles and perspectives and prompts that you can use, and that they help you to continue to translate theory into action. So instead of definitions, what I would like to focus on is something that I see is really important to how we engage with critical librarianship, and that's agency and action. The second part, the action, is pretty self-explanatory. It's doing something. Not really any surprises there, hopefully not anyway. It's not an especially complex idea on its own, but it is something that can be forgotten when we talk about critical librarianship or any matters of social justice or equality. And this is something that Junko Aisho and Cortez Severino highlight really well in an editorial paper on extractivism. So this is only an abbreviated extract that I have here, so I'd encourage you to look up the paper. But they write, theorizing social injustice is important. However, the challenge of devising real and concrete alternatives is where critical practice and scholarship is most needed. So in libraries, we have an overwhelming amount of conversations about diversity and equity, about dismantling unjust systems and practices, about decolonizing and indigenizing collections. And maybe sometimes, just maybe, we venture into talking about power and privilege as part of that. But we do need to be applying the principles and perspectives that emerge from those discussions to our work in libraries. We need to act on them. And that's where agency comes in. So the very simple definition of agency is that it's our capacity to act. Can we go ahead and do something? Can we take action? And that's a great question for us to be asking in libraries, because it forces us to think about what we're bringing to the table when it comes to actively addressing injustice or harm, as well as any limits that we have. And agency isn't just about our individual capabilities. It's also about considering whether we have the resources or power to influence others or to achieve a specific outcome. And if we do have some degree of agency to influence in libraries, and I believe that we do, then we need to make sure that we're thinking of libraries as social actors. So here, actors simply means as individuals and organizations that can engage in intentional action. And that doesn't mean that there's no challenges or limitations to this, but it does mean acknowledging that our work can influence practices, ideas, networks, organizations, and also the communities that we partner with too. So the way that I talk about agency and social actors comes from my research across libraries and international relations. And the very short version of my research is that I look at how libraries are actors at an international level. So how do libraries influence or have impact globally? And I'd actually initially focused on national libraries. And the reason is because they offer a really clear example of how cultural and knowledge institutions can project national influence. And this is where we see a concept called soft power come in. So it's a concept that's made its way into higher education and GLAMR sectors, and I am fairly critical of it while also seeking to understand how it plays out. But originally, soft power is an international relations term, and it refers to influencing through appeal and attraction instead of coercion. So it's about shaping the preferences of other actors by essentially using things like culture, values, and policies to achieve some of those objectives and some of those outcomes. In libraries, we're often providing access to information and knowledge that can influence and contribute to building a sense of identity for a specific community. But that means that we also need to understand how we're engaging in this and the agency that we then have to be reproducing, maintaining, or privileging a very specific social reality or knowledge system in doing so. I would say that libraries have symbolic power, and so we need to understand explicitly the values and perspectives that we're upholding in the decisions that we make. So Ben describes how by providing access to information, libraries contribute to both the self-image of a community or society, as well as its modes of operation. And this quote continues to discuss how libraries contribute to how people know and understand the world around them. So the practices that we support in libraries are going to either guide or limit people's choices in their access to information and education as well. We have an opportunity to empower people and to then act as a catalyst for any social change and facilitate some of those new directions. And this is all, of course, with the caveat that it's not up to libraries and the LIS profession to actually fix everything. But it is important that we have an understanding of the role that we play and the impact that we can have in wider communities and our own institutions as well. So sometimes that contribution to identity might be through engagement with national and cultural histories, like we see in state or national libraries or with archival and heritage collections. But we also contribute to building identity and community through how we design library spaces and through our partnerships or approaches to engagement. And it's really across all of our work. So that's going to be also more generally through the knowledge systems that we incorporate into collections, pedagogies, and other everyday practices as well. And in the university context, we're also partnering with a community that uses knowledge to construct narratives through assessment or research or various other types of knowledge production. So if there's one thing that I do want you to take away from this slide, it's that we're contributing to constructing a narrative in our library work. We're part of building a narrative up. I personally think that libraries having agency and being social actors is exciting and it's pretty significant. But again, it means that we need to take responsibility in our own professional practice, understand its impact, and then be prepared to actually address the underlying social and cultural dynamics behind it. And that does include any bias and inequalities. It's important to understand what we're actually legitimizing in the decisions that we're making. And that's a really large part of critical librarianship. So the basis of critical librarianship is critical theory and social justice. And these provide a bit of a framework and guiding principles for the critique and evaluation of our library practice. So this framework really supports us to examine social structures and cultural dynamics, and also to critique power within them. We're in a profession that is focused on information, and we support the access and dissemination of knowledge. And we can't easily separate conversations about knowledge from conversations about power. And I would say that we shouldn't. In libraries, we've inherited systems and practices that do centre the histories and knowledges of those with the most power to act. And this can go across all library areas. It's not just limited to collection development, cataloguing, or library spaces. It includes library instruction and pedagogy. I think I saw someone add that to the slide earlier. Things like organisational and workforce development, digital experience, governance and policy, service improvement. And again, that flows into things like evidence-based practice and how we approach things like research. It's something that those conversations about knowledge and power together flow across all of our work. My expectation of critical librarianship, though, is that we're actively engaged in addressing these social systems and structures in our practice. So it's not just enough to acknowledge that there might be injustice or elements of harm. We need to go beyond that acknowledgement and also be prepared to intentionally act as social actors and apply critical librarianship to practice. And yes, we should have that critical understanding of just the relationship of power and knowledge in libraries, but we need to go beyond that awareness and follow through with action. I do feel like it feels probably a little bit cliche to say at this point, but our actions and decisions throughout this aren't neutral, and critical librarianship does mean recognising that. And the concept of positionality really challenges the idea that we're neutral or that our work is neutral. So we have multiple social identities. They're fluid, they intersect, they change. And our beliefs around knowledge, reality, lived experiences, and our values are all things that we're bringing to our practice. And that can really change how you engage with or relate to someone's perspective because of the systems and understandings that they're grounded in. It can also impact on things like trust. And given that a lot of the work that we do is actually relationship driven or people-centered, that element of trust is important. We're working with people's stories, experiences, knowledge, and it all comes down to being relational. So I'm going to give an example of this, and I'll use myself. In this context, speaking to you all today, I'm conscious that my background is as a HDR researcher. I'm a librarian in management and leadership positions. I'm a white and non-Indigenous person, and I'm also a queer and disabled person. I've seen how my positionality influences my own library practices, the decisions that I make, how I relate to different people, and also then how people relate back to me. These identities and experiences guide my own values. They contribute to how I navigate my work, career, family, life experiences. They're going to be part of how I observe and interact in different social contexts and how I relate to different people who are on this call today. And when we're talking about critical librarianship, it's also important that we understand where we're coming from as both individuals and also within that institutional context that we exist in as well. There's always going to be different experiences of institutional histories, harms, biases, and also assumptions that we're bringing. And we do need to be prepared to reflect on and then challenge what that means for our work. Positionality also highlights where there's limitations and gaps in knowledge and experience. So it might reveal certain privileges or power that someone has had, or differences in access to information or social settings. So returning to that example, my perspectives in research on critical librarianship and agency have been shaped by my studies in international relations and art history and critical theory in these. Additionally, then my personal and professional experiences of inaccessibility or exclusion as a disabled or queer person factor into the perspectives that I bring. But understanding my positionality also shows where the limits of my knowledge are. So I'm limited and have gaps when it comes to Indigenous knowledges because I'm not an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. I don't have that connection and the experiences that come with Indigenous knowledge systems and cultures, and I haven't experienced the systemic inequities that surround those either. And this is where critical librarianship provides a way for us to be reflective and reflexive about our positionality. So reflection might be just thinking through our thought processes. So who we are, our motivations, the experiences that we bring, the context. Those are all things that I've kind of done there in describing my own positionality. On the other hand, being reflexive is then critically thinking through the impact and influence that this has on others. So that means actually considering how power and privilege relate to our own position and the decisions we make, whether that's individually or collectively. And so that positionality is reflected then in our perceptions of knowledge, reality, values, and all of those things that we're actually bringing to our work with us. And both positionality and reflexivity are critical to the questions that we actually ask of our communities when they're accessing library spaces and information, but also then looking back at our own practice, the questions that we're asking of ourselves, of our profession. And I'll get to that in a little bit later. But the quote on this slide here is actually borrowed from a paper on reflexivity in data science. So not libraries, but I do think it's incredibly relevant to libraries because we're also facilitating search, discovery, and knowledge production. So the authors here describe the importance of needing to be intentional in understanding our own position. If we're asking questions about what we're searching for, who we need to be bringing along with us, and also what the most appropriate process or methods might be for that. And the idea behind asking these questions is to make sure that we're not varnishing knowledge as something that is neutral or impartial, when it's often produced from a very narrow position or a privileged perspective. And traditionally, libraries and librarians have been seen as gatekeepers of knowledge. And really that only reinforces the idea or the illusion perhaps that libraries are spaces of knowledge that are entirely objective or impartial, when in reality, different positions or processes are going to see different knowledge produced. And that's something that's spoken to across this entire paper here. So a question that I like to ask is whose voices, perspectives, and values are reflected in and contribute to my work? And I adopted this question because in my previous role, I did a lot of work of evidence in libraries. So that was working with research, data, client feedback, all for the purpose of decision-making and continuous improvement. And I tried to recognise the impact that even small decisions now approaches, whether that was with data collection or user experience or organisational strategy, could then have on the directions that we took, and also its impact on other people as well. So for me, this question means that we do have to stop and pause for a moment. It means stopping to think about who's been involved in the process of collecting evidence, of making a decision, or of designing a system. Was it just me? Are there other people whose voices are missing, who should have been included? If so, should they be leading this work? Should they be consulted, involved in co-designing? And even then, at what point in the design process have they been involved? Has it been from the outset or something that we've done right at the end of a project? And there's a really great podcast episode that I encourage you to give a listen to. The episode's called Indigenous Data Rights with distinguished Professor Maggie Walter. And the episode covers how harmful methodologies and processes across data and research can present deficit narratives, which become part of decision-making. And that's in opposition to then Indigenous priorities, values, and cultures being reflected in decision-making. And the episode really stood out to me from an evidence and strategy perspective in libraries. And the reason I mention it is because so often we're not aware of the impact that certain narratives we create or that we choose to legitimize and reinforce in libraries can actually have beyond our own experiences. And that's where asking whose voices, perspectives, and values are included is a good starting point, though it is only a starting point. So I tend to focus on values when I'm being reflexive, and you'll see these in a lot of these questions here. They're a pretty big theme for me. But it's only through being reflexive and critical about these values that we can actually see the impact that they have. So if we're to break it down into some of these questions here, how do your individual or professional values shape your work? So for me, partnership or collaboration and inclusivity are some individual values of mine in the workplace, and you'll see elements of them in the majority of projects that I take on. They shape my work. But just as values alone, they're entirely aspirational. How I choose to act on those values could either empower, or it could marginalize communities, or it could cause harm. So by being aware of the values that I'm bringing, I can recognize how and why I'm choosing to act on them. In terms of professional values then, neutrality has traditionally been upheld as a library value, but you've already heard me say that our actions and decisions aren't necessarily neutral. And so critical librarianship is then an opportunity to evaluate and even dispel some of those traditional values, especially around knowledge. So instead of Western knowledge systems, how can we see Indigenous and non-Western knowledge systems and their values be at front and centre in our work? Another question might be, how do your institution's values shape your work? And I'd encourage you there to go beyond the values that might just be explicitly stated in any strategy, and also consider any implicit values that shape how you approach your work within that context. So that's really considering some of those unconscious values and the assumptions and making the implicit explicit. And then having done that, consider whose values currently count in your work. Whose values are you showing actually matter? And what are the power dynamics or structures that are then shaping those voices and values that you can see and that are visible in your work and that you've taken that time to examine? So I'm going to give everyone a moment to reflect on these questions here with another slide. So how do values shape your work? So I'll give everyone a moment to think and a chance to just jump back in. And you can answer this question about your own values, our profession's values, or your institution's values. So fairly open and broad, because I know we've got so many people here that there are going to be a lot of different experiences and insights and different sectors that we're bringing. So we've got unionism, mindset of openness and curiosity, empathy and compassion. We've got someone acknowledging that values are what gives them direction in their work. So we've got transparency and honesty, purpose. I love that one about using them to inform the questions that we're asking, providing a safe space for marginalised people, and I can't keep up at this point. We've got respect, patience and sustainability, recognising the way that we approach naming buildings. So that's something I've had recent conversations about as well, recognising, again, where that's been historically limited, looking at integrity in the decisions that we make and actions that we take. And I can also see some of the ways that we act on those values as well. So a few people have mentioned that it prompts them to actually be able to speak up. And again, of course, people saying that informs decision-making, how we deliver different programs. Community-led. I like that one there as well, again, about informing our approach to instruction and where we choose to actually spend our time as well, how we work together, what we celebrate, staff training. So again, I mentioned as well just previously, things like organisational development does come into something like critical librarianship. I don't think it's something that we discuss quite as much as other facets, but it's also there. Advocating for others, challenging bias and assumptions, serving the community. So I think we can see not only what those values are, but how they're actually applied in practice. Collections perspective there, what we do and don't buy, challenging the status quo, lifelong learning, which I think comes back to, again, right when I was saying at the start, that I do feel like critical librarianship does have that learning element to it, and that need to continue to engage, learn, understand, and bring that reflection and reflexivity to everything that we're doing. Continuous improvement. So that was something that was one of the first things that came to mind when I was looking at this topic, because I've done so much work in evidence-based practice, and things like value and impact and continuous improvement are a really big part of that. Inclusive language. I can't believe we're actually still going with this, to be honest. I feel like we have to have at least a few people jumping back in with different values. Again, so those cataloguing ones, recognising bias, open collegial collaboration. I like that one again as well. I feel like that kind of comes back into looking at what we're actually doing within our own organisation. And I think some of the things I love about this is that we are seeing that combination of both individual kind of reflection as well as looking at that wider institutional kind of level and that bigger picture. And so like that first question that we threw out, lots of different responses, lots of different approaches and different ways that we're actually thinking through this. So I will move on from that now, because I think we've had so many come through and I lost track about halfway through and struggled to keep up. But what that really reflects is that everything that we do is situated in a social context. We don't exist in our own perfect library silo. And we saw that in so many of the questions, so many of the responses to that question that came through. So as Magnus et al. Describes, because of that, we do need to consider matters of both power, privilege, and positionality in our work, and realise that it is a social and political act. And Magnus is talking about this in the context of taking a critical approach to library data and performance measures, and also some of the unquestioned assumptions that we bring to this. But again, it applies to all of our work. We're social actors in a lot of different spaces, and we need to interrogate how we act and what we're actually legitimizing. So ultimately, critical librarianship is in response to social contexts. And that means that we need to be reflexive and consider our impact and our influence. And the reason that I've focused so much on values here is because they play a really big role in what we legitimize in libraries. So that's what we go along with or promote as acceptable, even if it's inadvertently. Values not only reflect some of our positionality, but they drive our actions and decisions. So returning to what I mentioned earlier when I was talking about how libraries can engage in and enact soft power, we influence through our practices, priorities, and policies, and then reinforce the legitimacy of certain values and identities. Libraries are part of institutions that are constantly communicating their value, their impact, and their legitimacy. Whether that's locally, nationally, internationally, it's a large part of that kind of social process that is being negotiated. They're contributing to persuading stakeholders of their own and their institution's legitimacy as social actors. And that's often by advancing a very specific set of social values that shape and are then in turn shaped by the institutions and systems that we're part of. So we could consider open scholarship as an example here. We're pretty big on advocating for open access in libraries, but a lot of the time, the infrastructure and approaches that we have might benefit particular types or disciplines of knowledge. And so usually that comes down to being Western knowledge systems, or we might find that there's priorities and specific practices that are ignored that are part of Indigenous or non-Western knowledge systems. So how we approach advocating for openness in libraries is going to either reinforce and legitimize systems that have a bias towards particular knowledge types. And part of what we need to do there is highlighting that need to be more inclusive and equitable in our processes and infrastructure to avoid that overrepresentation of knowledge by already dominant social groups and demographics. And again, thinking back just that last question of values, it was a very simple question about how values kind of impacted our work and influence, but we already saw people recognizing the way that they were looking beyond their own, individual work to what that looks like in a wider social kind of context. And so that can start with questioning our own practices and making values that might have been implicit or have gone unnoticed actually explicit. So if they're explicit, then we're going to be acknowledging that they're there. We can critique and challenge and question them. And so we might ask things like, what does this mean for how we approach Indigenous principles and knowledges? Or do our approaches limit the inclusion and expression of different knowledges? And if so, how can we rectify this? And questions like this really should challenge us, and they should also reveal where we already have influence. So if our approaches are limiting the inclusion and expression of non-Western knowledges, that's an influence. It's just not a very great one. So we're revealing the agency we already do have and also shining a light on the values that shape it. So these are the questions that I'm going to leave you with today. What values and whose values do your library priorities reflect? So this question encourages you to think through the underlying values that shape your work and also guide your direction. Next, what and whose narratives are these priorities legitimizing? So we need to recognize that not only do our values drive action, but our work and our actions in libraries then legitimize a particular social narrative. What is this and whose narrative actually counts? And finally, what or whose knowledge systems is your work contributing to building or reinforcing? So again, we're working with knowledge. We're engaging with social structures and systems to collect, preserve, display, and make it accessible. Do we know the knowledge systems that we're actually reinforcing? Knowledge systems influence, and we are working with that knowledge and those systems, and we're part of that influence. So all in all, I hope that these questions prompt you to critically interrogate the values that guide our work in libraries, the agency that we have to contribute to social narratives, and also the knowledge systems and identities that we choose to build or reinforce, even if we don't immediately realize it. And then I also hope that they can be prompts to seek change and choose to, wherever possible, act. And not just act for the sake of doing something, but to act for the sake of communities, for the sake of achieving inclusive and equitable practices, and for achieving knowledge systems that empower the people within those communities as well. And with that, thank you, and I will hand back to you, Tui.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions in from the chat. So we've got, can we understand positionality for the institution that we work within? And how does this look different to individualized positionality?
Well, that's a good question. I'm going to say a tentative yes, but I think there's probably a tentative yes, but I think that probably requires a different kind of unpacking. I feel like it's almost easier to do that as an individual. Again, we usually focus on being quite reflective, and we might encourage reflective practice as an individual, but then needing to recognize that it's not just our values that are influencing our work, they do exist at that institutional level too. And looking at how we negotiate, navigate, reconcile what that actually looks like, and potentially where it differs from our own as well. So I think there would be institutional Positionality, especially if, again, we are looking at not just individuals as social actors, but institutions as actors at a whole bunch of different levels across society.
Yeah, I think the one way I look at it is, are my values aligned with the institution I work with? And then you can tell generally what the positionality of your institution is. So sometimes there's a bit of working around. Sometimes you have to figure out your own positionality to go, why can't I get these things done where I work? And it might be that your position is very different to the institution's. So that might be one way to look at it. Question I wanted to ask you, it's a couple of things. One of them is at Deakin Library, we just have recruited for Indigenous Librarianship cadet. Shout out to Kalina, who just started on the 5th. We recognise that positionality was very important within the space, in particular in relation to being a librarian, working with Indigenous collections, or just working in the library in general. What do you see as the next big step for our library sector to take if we're considering positionality within those particular roles? Where do you think the roles are that we need to actually specifically look at positionality?
So just to clarify, Tui, in
Yeah.
terms of looking at more of that workforce development and what the next step is there. So I think that positionality is probably us taking that next step, and it's something I've seen a massive increase in. I think there's probably more work to be done across a variety of different levels, roles, looking at what diversity looks like for intersectionality as well. I think that's a large part of it. A lot of conversations that I actually have tend to perhaps only look at one aspect of someone's positionality, again, without recognizing that there is these intersecting kind of dimensions. So I mentioned just in my presentation that I identify as queer and also disabled. And that's something that for me, I see as both of those kind of weaving into a very unique individual perspective and that I bring to my work. And the same would apply for someone in any, kind of social group. And so I think recognizing that need for intersectionality and understanding what that positionality actually looks like when it's applied in a role. A lot of the time, I think we tend to just put it as a label within a role, like, yes, we're hiring for someone with this particular identity or positionality, and we hope that they will bring something to that role. I don't think there's always a lot of acceptance then for what is actually being brought to that role, or it does take a lot of, and you might be able to comment on this from, again, that perspective at Deakin as well, too, but that support as well to navigate what it looks like for that person in that role to be able to bring themselves to that work, because that is a lot of emotional energy and labour in and of itself. And we need to make sure that if we are stepping into kind of recognizing how people's, experiences and positionality do contribute to our work and can have a really positive influence on the direction that our sector takes, how we're actually supporting people in that and valuing those perspectives that they're actually bringing. And again, coming back to it, actually acting on it as well. It's all well and good for us to kind of be celebrating it in terms of just a label, something nice that we've done to be inclusive, but actually acting on some of those decisions and some of the perspectives that we want to be inviting into this, and looking at it at that, again, that kind of systems level as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think often in these spaces, especially someone who's, I'm Yamaji Noongar, I work in the space as an Indigenous person, and even I forget some of the, as we say, colonial load that I have to work with in the space, and probably the extra work that Deakin would have to put in and other library spaces would have to put in for our staff in relation to having to work in this space, because it can be, can be emotionally draining sometimes. I've got another question here that is, what is your perspective on academic libraries shifting to a digital by default approach to collection management in light of known biases within the publishing and e-publishing industries, and e-publishing being comparatively rare in developing countries, e-formats being less likely to be offered by smaller publishers who often publish marginalised voices, etc.?
That is a massive question.
It is, but I guess it's the part of it is in relation to digital by default.
Yeah, so I'm probably not going to be able to do it justice in just this space and time, to be honest. My first thought when I saw I'm just going to unpack it a little bit. When I first saw that digital by default, and this is also the caveat that I haven't worked in specifically in those collection management kind of roles, so I probably don't have quite the perspective or experience that someone else might be able to bring to this. I have seen, I guess, a lot of conversations around user needs and diversity issues in terms of what that digital by default perspective actually brings. I think this is about also understanding our community's needs, what that looks like, recognizing, again, my research has been also at that international level, but I have also recognized the need that that also needs to be stripped back to the local. So looking at what our communities need and actually taking the time to understand their needs. 100% agree about publishing and known biases around that as well. Just rereading the question again, it's a massive one. E-formats being less likely to be offered by small publishers. Yes, absolutely. I think we're also seeing some great work in the open educational practice space in this area as well, though. Shout out to probably Nikki Anderson, who wrote a text around diversity and inclusion and how we actually bring those to publishing in that space as well. Look, I think it's, absolutely massive question. There's a lot there that it really depends, I think, on the communities that we're working with. I assume this is higher education context as well, and probably some of that, individual institution kind of level as well. But 100% agree with, the fact that there are those limited formats. And I've had conversations recently in the open education space as well, where people have realized that even the work that they're doing that is digital hasn't necessarily been accessible to people, including internationally, who they assumed that it would be. So I've received emails from people outside of Australia going, I can't actually access this because of some of the formats that just aren't available, or things like access to internet as well. So this, it depends, I think, what we're actually focusing on there, but big question and agree with the sentiment.
Yeah, I agree. I also have a problem with that as well. Someone who's worked in communities where we just don't have the ability to work with, digital resources. It can be quite difficult. So we've got, do you have any examples or real world applications of where critical librarianship and international social action has been implemented?
Yes, but I think a lot of these are sometimes probably in some of the smaller things as well. Again, I think I mentioned right back at the start that there's probably people who don't realise that they're already applying a critical librarianship lens. Perhaps they're working towards inclusivity in various ways. And again, it's just a matter of some of the language that we use in being critical about what we're bringing. Personally, I tried to apply that across my role in evidence-based practice. So that was everything from founding a advisory committee around the EDI kind of space, and then inviting different voices and perspectives into that work to help develop it. There's ways that I'm then, though, looking back at that and quite critical about how I approached that, and whether advisory committee was perhaps the right decision, whether there's approaches that might have hindered different voices being able to speak up in that space, who was actually looking back at that emotional labor as well, who was actually leading it, and the amount of work that might be put onto them. So I think it's hard to provide clear-cut examples. I think there's a lot of great stuff that's happening in this space. Lots of people mentioned critical librarianship around things like cataloging practices, metadata. So we are seeing it in those spaces. I feel like a lot of my own examples are things that are kind of ongoing, though, where I've kind of gone, this was a great start in this space, or I've kind of set something, or I've seen someone else set something in motion that we can then build on. Because I think a lot of the time there isn't, a final kind of endpoint to a lot of this, and we can't always define exactly what this is going to look like. And it is a bit of a learning process and a bit of a cycle of reflection and reflexivity in how we do things and how that work develops.
I agree. For me, one of the things that when you work in this space, you probably do it automatically without realizing. So I worked on a project called Bibliothèques sans frontières, Libraries Without Borders. It's a French company that looks about putting libraries into remote communities and like even urban communities. And part of that first step is the resources they give you in French. So you're not going to be keeping those French books within the, it's basically a box that you unpack. So if you're going to put it in the middle of New York, you're probably going to look for resources for New York. So I think a lot of us already do that work. Maybe we don't think about it in terms of what that might look like. We just get on and go, does this fit our users? That's kind of the first step with critical librarianship, not just your own perspective, but are we actually servicing our community in a way that's actually appropriate for them? So maybe that's probably why people might have a bit of a hard time understanding what critical librarianship is if we're just putting it behind one lens.
Absolutely. I think especially when we think of it in terms of theory, again, we miss that action part, and that there is a lot that we are already kind of doing and that we can build on to actually have that impact. And again, looking back, there are things that I'm sure people are probably thinking of that they're going, oh, that's, something where I asked similar questions, or where I felt challenged in how I approach this in my practice.
Right. So another question, what kind of actions can we take to engage with the public about these topics in a way that encourages action?
Oh, interesting. So I'm going to interpret that as engaging with the public as librarians about critical librarianship. Off the top of my head, I feel like things like co-design and user experience and bringing those kind of perspectives into our work, and making sure that we do have that partnership element there is really important. Again, that comes back to whose voices that we're actually, listening to and engaging with, and making sure that's from the outset too. So having done work in evidence-based practice and that user kind of experience space, there were times where I'm thinking it would have been great. And sometimes it wasn't always feasible. Again, small scale, you work with projects that are kind of evolving as you go, but where I've gone, what point are we actually bringing someone else's voices into this? Should someone else be co-designing this with me? I think that kind of invites a conversation around who is actually included in libraries, who feels welcome, who we can kind of reach out to partner with. So I would say partnership. I'd say look to your local communities and see, look at how you're already partnering. And even if you are already, do have what you'd see as strong partnerships, at what point are they actually occurring? Is it from the outset? Where does that starting point need to be? Who's involved in those conversations and actually in designing what some of that work and processes look like as well? And again, making sure that that's equitable and understanding the work that that actually goes into it, because I think a lot of the time we don't recognize that it is actually work to contribute in this space. And so again, that brings in a whole layer of how we approach those partnerships equitably as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think as someone who works in a library as the only Indigenous person, well, there's two of us now, but I have to rely on my community, and that's the community broadly in Australia and within the areas that I work on those things, because even I don't know. So, I think the co-design and the partnerships is a very good point in relation to that. It's very valuable. I've got two more questions. The next one is, thoughts on university library roles in helping to support the broader community's access to and translation of research and information more broadly around important social issues such as ongoing oppression and inequalities of people and our planet's ecosystems.
We are loving really big questions today. So I'm just going to take a moment to reread this. Okay. I feel like this is a bit of an ongoing conversation, and I've recently chatted with a few people, partially in some of my doctoral research around the library's role in knowledge translation. And I'm going to say there's a variety of different perspectives around what role we should play. I personally think this is going to be a bit of an abstract response initially, but I personally think it does come back to recognising the library's role within that bigger picture. So I mentioned knowledge production a few times across that presentation, and I've been challenged on that a little bit. The library doesn't have a role in knowledge production. That's something that academics are doing. The way I see it, though, is that we are actually contributing to that process. In any of the work that we're doing, we are playing some kind of facilitative role around knowledge production, and that can extend to things like knowledge translation as well. I have a feeling this is going to look very different between different university libraries and between different roles, and is going to depend on what kind of existing relationship they have with those communities, and how they're actually invited into those spaces. I think our conversations around open research and leaning then into things like open science are probably a really good fit for some of those conversations. So we can see about ecosystems there, and around oppression and inequality. So I mentioned the open access perspective. That comes right back into supporting communities to actually have access to research that they can actually translate. So I think there's probably already a lot of things that we are doing in this space. It's about recognizing where we're fitting into that bigger picture in university libraries, and being able to articulate the role that we actually play in them as well. And I think a lot of the time it is some of those smaller details that we don't actually realize necessarily how it fits into the big picture. We tend to get very focused on those day-to-day processes, but when you step back and you actually see, I guess, where it fits in, it does actually support that broader community access. And even if you're in a role that isn't necessarily community facing, to say, it's, that there is still part of those processes that is part of the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Things like, open research, open access just jump to mind immediately.
Yeah, I agree. It is a very big topic. It's completely ongoing. I think one of the first things that we're doing, and as you've pointed out, we're diversifying our workforce to actually cope with just those very questions, is probably one of our big steps in that space. One nice, quick, simple question to sort of wrap it up. What is the role of critical librarianship in information services?
That feels like a much shorter but equally big question. Oh gosh, I feel like I need to redo my whole presentation to answer that. I would say that, well, I'd say it's a crucial year role. I started off by saying it's part of continuous improvement. So my perspective, coming from a role that was previously in evidence-based practice, which focused on value and impact and continuous improvement, is that critical librarianship is part of improving information and library services. That's the way that I see it. I see things like inclusion, belonging, equity as being part of what we need to be doing to improve our services, to ensure that our information services are actually equitable, that they are welcoming and inclusive, and that we are including those diverse perspectives, and not just including them, but also acting on them and acting on those voices. So I would say it's fundamental to continuous improvement for our services, if I could sum it up in one sentence.
Absolutely agree. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. It was a pleasure to meet you in person at the ALIA conference. A pleasure that we've done this online, and the recording will be available for all those people that have registered. I look forward to everything else that you write in the future and reading it with absolute glee, really, to be honest. I really love reading what you've written and just learning a bit more from you every single day. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
No problems. Thanks everyone else online. We may have another information session later in the year. We're just looking at what that might look like. Thank you.